Not everybody is spiritually intelligent, just like not everybody is mechanically intelligent or linguistically intelligent. There is a subset of people who do have this ability to alter their consciousness, to shift consciousness, to become more open, more aware, to be able to see into problems rather than just to look at things at the surface level.
How well can you read the room? Meaning you can tell the needs, the wants, and the desires of your people, just as much as you can feel the stress and the anxiety, the fears, and even the calm. Basically, you have this ability to move the energy, to soothe people, to serve the highest good and intention, and really reach those goals. In the corporate world, however, bridging the gap between science and spirituality is still seen as woo-woo in some areas. And yes, I'm using those quotes for those who are listening. But why is that? Why are we not being able to bring these together with much more ease? Well, Dr. Robyn McKay, who is an award-winning psychologist, has a theory about this. And it's a good one. I'll tell you that. She lived in the corporate world. She did the corporate life. And when she took a leap of faith to really get in touch with her authentic self, she realized what she can achieve to normalize spiritual intelligence, not just in the corporate space, but in life in general. How does that sound? Now, if you're sitting there scratching your head, I get it. And you're thinking, what in the world is spiritual intelligence, Hil? I got you. We're going to go over that. But also we're going to cover how it can benefit you and those around you, and how you can kick that burnout to the curb and be a human being over a human doing. And I know you know what I'm talking about there. And for those feelers out there, the empaths, a real challenge for you to ignite the mind even further when it comes to breaking boundaries. Now, if this sounds like something up your alley, don't forget to hit that subscribe button wherever you're tuning in and pay it forward. And yes, your reviews and your ratings do matter, and I do appreciate them. But more so, I love to hear from you. So leave me a message at speakpipe.com/HIListically Speaking and tell me how I'm doing. I may share your voice on a future episode of the show. But first, it's time to ask yourself some what-if questions with Dr. Robyn McKay. Well, we are back in the space. My friend, Dr. Robyn McKay, you are a breath of fresh air. I'm so glad to be able to welcome you on the HIListically Speaking Podcast. You welcomed me on your show, and I just love when we're able to collaborate and share like-minded information, but also learn from each other. So, Robyn, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel like it's been a million years ago since you were on Becoming the Channel. It hasn't been that long, though.
It hasn't. We were just talking about that. But you know what? When you add up all the things that we're doing in between, all the time that we spend, holding space for others, traveling, it feels like it could be a year sometimes. Like when I first came on, I go, when did we do this? February? And you're like, no, it was May.
I think I was going to look to see.
I think it was May. And then I came out on your show, which was incredible. So I'm so glad that we're able to just be here again, talking about spiritual intelligence, intuition, the science, the spirit, everything in between, burnout. I mean, there's so much that I really want to cover that you and I both talk about and do in our own work. But, you know, what's so beautiful is that when we come together and we learn from each other, my dad used to say this, that surround yourself with people who massage your neurons, meaning there's always something we're going to learn from somebody else. And it's so important that we hold space for others to be able to do that. So what is it that Dr. Robyn McKay truly embodies as a psychologist, but also someone who is an entrepreneur, an executive in the field, and someone who is not doing things the traditional way when you think of psychologists? So who are you and how are you showing up in the world?
Well, I think that the thing that defines me is that I've been a clear, intuitive channel since I was a little kid. And we didn't have words for that all those years ago. But I just always knew stuff that other people didn't know. Like I would know in my third grade math class that my teacher was having a pop quiz. So I would stay in at recess to study so I could get an A+ on it. So that was always part of who I was growing up. And I was also a STEM girl. I loved science. I remember in fourth grade learning about molecules and that everything was energy and that even my desk was vibrating. It was just vibrating very slowly, being completely fascinated and somewhat activated by that as well. And then getting my first microscope when I was probably 11 or so. And I was so disappointed because of the light source. It was a mirror. And I was like, what are we even doing here? As only a STEM girl could be. So I've always been this bridge between science and spirit. And I think that that's probably the thing that really defines me, is that I'm not just an intuitive, and I'm certainly not just a scientist, but I am, in who I be, the bridge between both worlds. And that's one of the things that I'll talk about with my clients a lot, is how can we bridge science and spirit, and how can we bridge reason and intuition? There has to be a way to do that. And somehow I've been able to do that from the time I was a young child.
Mm. And how many other people do you think in the field do this kind of work? I mean, I've had many conversations on HIListically Speaking, and I've had other psychologists and psychiatrists even on here that are starting to branch out of that area of the traditional Freudian way. We're open to the other possibilities, which, by the way, these things, talking about spirituality and bridging the gap between the intuition and the traditional reasoning, is nothing new. I think it's something that we have noticed in this field. We've talked about, I even remember talking about this when I was getting my certification in hypnotherapy, that what was seen as woo-woo back in the day is really just channeling into our own energy and frequencies and being comfortable with that, right?
Spiritual intelligence is the area of psychology that looks at really consciousness. But the roots of spiritual intelligence began as psychologists like me, my predecessors actually, or the generation before me, started looking at what are the medicine men and women in indigenous cultures doing to create transformation in their communities? What are the curanderas and curanderas doing? I butcher my Spanish, so I apologize for that. But what's going on in the indigenous cultures that's bringing about transformation? And how can we bring that, not to culturally appropriate anything, but there are those of us who recognize that we have that same core ability to be able to bring about transformation in real world circumstances by using nothing more than our breath, our words, and the energy that surrounds and enfolds us in our practices. And so that really was the early exploration around this idea of spiritual intelligence. It's the definition that I like to use of spiritual intelligence is the capacity to alter your consciousness in the service of yourself or another person, and the use of spiritual tools and energetic techniques in order to bring about real world transformation. So those are the two pieces of it. Behind closed doors, I think a lot of psychologists will say that a lot of the transformation that our patients and our clients experience are somewhat unexplainable. Now, in the last probably 25 years or so, there's been this big movement in psychology toward evidence-based practices, empirically supported treatments, to kind of medicalize the transformation, and in some ways, in my opinion, legitimize what we do and explain it from a rational/database perspective. But there's an X factor in transformation. And I believe that X factor has to do with consciousness. And I think that it can be explained by the spiritual intelligence that some, not all, but some psychologists, counselors, therapists definitely embody, and we're actually born with the capacity to do so.
And when you first discovered this, was it kind of like an aha moment, like things are different, or did you always feel that intuitive sense and spiritual sense within yourself?
That's such a great question. I like to talk about it like this. I was intuitive my whole life. I didn't have words for it. Then I went through my quarter life crisis. I was about 28, and I found a picture of myself from high school graduation. My eyes were bright. I looked like I had the world by the tail. And 10 years later, I was working in biotech, driving 45 minutes one way to work in rush hour traffic, stopping at the Krispy Kreme store to buy donuts and a Diet Coke. That was my idea of self-care. And I really had this moment of looking at the girl who I was and saying, where are you? Because this is not the life I had envisioned. And that existential moment brought about a bunch of changes. It sort of cascaded into my life, where I ended up divorcing my college sweetheart, who I'd been married to since we finished college, basically, and figuring out who I was and taking responsibility for my spiritual and energetic gifts in a way that I had never done before, because I had never been aware that I needed to do so before. So that was a turning point. It was actually that quarter life crisis that set me on this journey. And I began understanding myself in terms of, I had this capacity to do things that other people just kind of either marveled at, or just kind of, to your point with the woo-woo, they're like, what are you even talking about with soul retrievals and going to shamans and things like that? But that actually happened very quickly after that quarter life crisis began, is that I got myself into therapy, and the therapist actually had connections to the shamanic community in Kansas City. And I was having these spiritual experiences during my awakening process that I had a lot of questions about. So he just referred me over to one of the local shamans, and I started working with her, not regularly, but enough to get a sense of like, there's something more to this than, and in some ways legitimizing what I was doing. In other words, helping me understand myself in a new way that my family and friends didn't understand.
Quarter life crisis. I'm really stuck on that one because we hear so much about midlife crisis, but really we do go through that. I'm out of college. I'm in this new stage in my life. I'm kind of an adult, but I'm not yet. The brain is just starting to be fully developed. Yeah. Not that we're thinking about that at 25, but it really is a real milestone in our lives.
It is.
You know? And that first attempt at starting to think, how do I want to show up in the world or be an adult, or are people going to take me seriously? And in that, when you start thinking so deeply about what you're talking about, are people really going to take me seriously? You know, because we're still in that world of, we're open to this possibility that there's more, right? And that we have these gifts within ourselves, and that the energy and the frequency of things do matter. But there's still that an uncertainty. And of course, as you and I both know, and many of the listeners, that the brain does not like uncertainty at all. It's going to go to the negative before it goes anywhere else, right? So from that time period, how were you able to really embrace that and move into this new space, this more not as comfortable space, but more comfortable for you?
More comfortable for me, for sure. So a couple of things happened. One is, remember I said I've always been a bridge between science and spirit. So
sure,
I knew all that stuff when I was a little kid. I had precognitive dreams, but I also knew from the time I was 5 that I was going to be a doctor and I was going to write books. And so I had this pull toward, I have to, sometimes we say we have choices, and I suppose that we do, but like in this case, like everything inside of me was compelled that I had to get my PhD. It was time. I had to go. It was time to go. And I actually made the decision to get my PhD because I had been reading some books by spiritual teachers who had PhDs. In fact, 2 of them, Wayne Dyer and Dorian Virtue, were the 2 who I really paid attention to at that time. Both had PhDs in the field that I ended up getting a PhD. And in part, I think I chose that because I was compelled to, but I also looked at what they were doing in their careers with their lives. And I said, well, I'm like them. So I must have to therefore get a PhD in psychology like they did. And that was kind of I don't know how good of a decision-making point that was, but it was definitely something that influenced my decision to find a PhD program in psychology that was, really the opposite of woo. I went to the University of Kansas, but I was in counseling psychology, and the counseling psychology community really was embracing the study of spiritual intelligence definitely the study of career development, which is where I landed, career engagement, intuition as part of the career decision-making process. That was one of my contributions at that time to the field. And it was there that I really began integrating the scientist who I had always been. I had worked in biotech, and I had actually got to work with high-powered microscopes later in my career.
Not just mirrors.
much to my 10-year-old's great delight. And I started integrating during grad school that I was not only on the academic track where I was being classically trained as a psychologist, but also I was on a 7-year apprenticeship in spiritual intelligence where I was working with spiritual teachers, Hawaiian medicine people, shamans. I was getting all of this other education and training, and I was learning about consciousness and how to create transformation using your breath, using your words, using your vision. And it was within the field of psychology that I was actually able to start integrating that to some degree as I was going through my PhD program.
I have to say, Dr. Wayne Dyer is a wonderful person to look up to. I call him my spiritual daddy. I've always called him that because he's such and I say it as though he's still here because he is, right? Mm-hmm. He's around us constantly. And I still feel like I hear so much of what he says, even when I'm not listening to a podcast or listening to his talks or anything like that, or reading his books. He's just so present in the way that he showed up in the world, especially when you think about where he came from, you know? But so what is the actual degree that you got in your PhD? Was it just straight out psychology?
I got a PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Kansas. My focus was career development and the psychology of gifted and talented people. So it was really how creative and talented people make decisions about their careers, move through life. The social, emotional, and career needs of creative people is where I would say I landed in that degree program.
It sounds similar to what I did. I did industrial organizational psychology, which, by the way, I think I chose that because it didn't have a thesis. That was the main reason I chose that degree. But in my mind, I thought, how interesting is it that we're coming out of school, we're going into the workplace. What is the behavior of people? Why are they thinking this way? Why are they doing this? Not even knowing what IO Psych really was back then, but having a clear understanding, like with your degree, that we're really trying to understand the psychology of people in a way that how are they dealing with situations and doing certain things, and what made them come to that decision, and how are they showing up in the world. And from that, I imagine that is what has made you such an excellent source and support system and guide for those who are in the corporate space, especially when we talk about dealing with burnout and overwhelm.
100%. The other thing that I want to go back to just IO psychology and behavior, the psychology of behavior for a second, because I was always leaning into the psychology of optimal human development. How do we fulfill our potential? How do we self-actualize? That was a point of contention early in my training when I wanted to talk about self-actualization with my clients, and my professors were like, "Robyn, they're not ready for that."
Slow your roll, girl.
They introduced Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I was like, "Oh, I don't want to be there. I want to be up there."
Right.
So, if you want to put a pin in that, I'll talk about my theory of Maslow's hierarchy later on. But
I don't think I've talked about that on the podcast yet. I don't think you would think I would have, but no, it hasn't come up.
Get ready, because I've got a whole thing on that. We'll get to that. We'll do that toward the end, maybe. So, so looking at human potential is really where I've always landed. One of my professors said to me one time when I was describing what I was interested in studying, intuition, creativity, optimal human development, she said, "Research is me search." And I thought that was such a great way to explain why I was doing what I was doing, is that it wasn't just about other people. It was also benefiting me. It's that sacred reciprocity that I think a lot of us miss out on as helpers and healers, is that we're always over-giving. And even in the corporate space, listen, there are a lot of hyper empaths, people who feel everything, who are beyond empathetic. They're actually like almost experiencing other people's emotions as well, or they're intuitive, but they're in the closet and they have this sense of knowing that other people may not have. So they're hiding all of that, which takes a lot of energy and effort to do so, especially in a corporate setting. And then they're still in that grit, tenacity, hard work, the gerbil wheel cycle that if you've been in corporate, you know what I'm talking about. And certainly one of the things that I think that the people who I work with in the corporate space also appreciate about my work is not just my psychology background, but the fact that I spent 10 years in corporate, in biotech and the pharmaceutical industry, even as I was getting my PhD. So I've been in those situations. I've burned out in corporate. I've been up at 3 a.m. in the morning sending off emails because that's what the leadership was doing. It wasn't necessarily an expectation, but I wanted to be like them. So I was doing the things that they were doing. And it ended up burning, when you burn the candle at both ends, eventually you're going to run out of wax. And so having that embodied understanding of burnout, of the corporate environment, I think has been one of the gifts I've been able to bring to my clients in corporate. And it certainly is something that they themselves have said that they appreciate about me. I have that real world experience and understanding, even though, of course, the world of work has changed, especially in the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. And that's something I talk about quite regularly in conversation, just general conversation about how many people are walking away from the corporate sector and going into something that is more heart work, something that's really like resonating with people, but also the appreciation I know I have, and I know many who I've spoken to have, for those who have, you don't have to, the CEOs that have worked in the mailroom tend to have more compassion and understanding because they've been there, which is the same for those who are doing the kind of work we do. When we've worked on that side, it's much easier to have an understanding for it because we've been there, right? Like as a journalist, my background being a journalist, when I'm working with other media professionals, I get it. I understand what secondary trauma. I get it. I've lived it. I was on air during 9/11. I get it. But even if I didn't have that same experience, it's something about working in that similar field that lets somebody know, oh, I'm not just sitting here and some Freudian psychologist is saying, tell me how you really feel. You've been it. You've been in the trenches, basically. So from that, so was it like, did you go into your PhD? Did you do corporate and then go PhD? So you spent a number of years corporate and then went back to school, which, oh my gosh, even harder.
I did. Well, it was actually such a blessing for me. But I remember I said, when I was a little girl, I knew I was going to be a doctor. And I thought, as many Gen X women were trained, is that you just go straight from undergrad and then you map into whether it's engineering, medicine, the law, media, whatever, wherever you're mapping into. And I had applied for medical school and I didn't get in. And I didn't have a mentor to tell me, kiddo, a lot of people don't get in right away. Go figure it out and take another run at it. So that was a turning point in my life when I didn't get in. And thank God, BTW, I didn't get in.
Right.
Well, especially because a lot of my clients now are physicians and they work with me because of my credentials and because of who I am, but I also understand them intimately because I've worked with them for so long. Both of my sisters are physicians, in fact. So I have that working knowledge. I don't have to be in their field to be able to support them. When I didn't get into my medical school, I found a different route and I went into biotech. And that's when I worked in the Biosafety 3 lab and did all of this work with crazy microorganisms and burned out my first time as I was eating Krispy Kreme donuts. It was during that time that I found this really cool volunteer program, mentoring program, where mentoring girls into STEM fields. And this was in the late 90s. So that was when I was like, oh my God, I have to do this work. This is really important. So that intersection of science with psychology, with mentoring, that was actually the place where I felt most at home, because that was really, again, it was that bridge, right, between science and spirit, that I was able to make connections with these young women, to mentor them in the ways of science and what to do next with their careers. And that was actually the piece that I think really made me an attractive candidate to this University of Kansas program, because career psychology, vocational psychology was a big piece of their program, which is where I landed early on. So, right, so I spent about 5 years working in biotech and then in the pharmaceutical industry. And while I was in pharma, I was doing medical writing, clinical drug development, that kind of thing. That was when I just really felt that call to my heart. That was around the time I was in my quarter life crisis as well, which was like, I can't keep doing this. This is like, it's good money, but I'm not fulfilled. And I know I'm meant to be doing something else. And that was like a core level knowing. That was when I made the decision to leave my now ex-husband, to go back to school and start my master's program in psychology, and then eventually start my PhD. So I started my master's in 2001. I think I started in 2001 because it was right before I had a test on 9/11. I was in Kansas. Nothing was going on in Kansas. We were in the center of the country on that day. And I remember I went to class. Class had not been canceled. And my professor said to us, I know something terrible has happened in our country today. And you all, at some point, are going to be called upon to just keep going, even in the face of great terror like today. So you have to take your test. And I was like, my God. So I sat for my test. I think I got a B on it and got out of there and went on with my life. But that was, it was like one of those moments where you sometimes have to keep going in the face of great trauma. And that was one of those moments that I experienced for myself. And at that time, I was still working full time in corporate and continued to do so up until I had to really move into my clinical training, my pre-doc internship, and then obviously my postdoc as well. That's when I made the transition into psychology full time.
Wow. And it's not easy to go back to school.
Easy. I was a perpetual, I loved school.
Oh, you're a professional student.
Oh my God. Well, this is something that's so interesting, especially for talented women, that when we get to an existential crisis point, we look at, what am I really good at? Well, I knew if I can follow a syllabus, this is an area that I feel super competent at, and I'm going to do that. Now, I know that for me, that was my way forward, but I think it bears some examination. If you are at a point of crisis, maybe school is not necessarily what's needed. Maybe there's a different avenue, or maybe it's a non-traditional route of education, not the traditional route of education. So there's just a mindfulness about that. I think that it's important to pay attention to.
There's no right or wrong. It's just do you. You do you. And like you were saying, going back to the Gen X world, that our generation, it's go to school, graduate, get a job, get married, have baby. And I think we're kind of the last generation of that, really, and even us, I think we're kind of a hybrid of that. So It's good to see that happening. Before we go any further, I just want to say we are here with Dr. Robyn McKay. She is a psychologist. She is an award-winning psychologist. Let me put that out there. And also an entrepreneur working with Fortune 500 companies and entertainment and just like doing the heart work. And I want to get into that. I want to really talk about spiritual intelligence because I know we have a little time left. But can you define what that really means for those who might be curious about it?
So spiritual intelligence consists of two major components. One is the capacity to alter your consciousness in the service of yourself or another person. The second piece is the ability to use spiritual practices and energetic techniques and tools in order to bring about real world transformation. So those are the two pieces of it. Not everybody is spiritually intelligent, just like not everybody is mechanically intelligent or linguistically intelligent. There is a subset of people who do have this ability to alter their consciousness, to shift consciousness, to become more open, more aware, to be able to see into problems rather than just to look at things at the surface level. It shows up in corporate like this. You walk into a meeting, everybody's there, you read the room. You can tell what the needs are of the people in the room, who's stressed, who's going to make stuff go sideways. And you do you're able to actually kind of move the energy in a way that soothes people, or in a way that is in the highest service of the group or the project in order to bring about the goals that you want to have happen. And we do that kind of without knowing it. It's so automatic, if that makes sense.
Organic. Yeah.
It is. The problem is, and here's the thing that I've come to realize, that there are a lot of people who are very, very empathic who work in the corporate space. So in other words, and empathy is one of those terms that everybody kind of kicks around and nobody really knows what it means. But I think about it as just a sense, an emotional intelligence, right? A sense of that my emotions are important and I value them and I can feel them. And I can also pick up on your emotions. I can read your nonverbal cues and I can read your facial expressions. But beyond that, there are some of us who are, I would say, hyper empathic, who can actually feel other people's feelings as well. So here's the challenge. If you're one of those people who can feel everything, some of that's not yours. We have mirror neurons in our brains that literally reflect and amplify the emotions of other people. We don't get taught that. From the time we're little kids, we're just feeling everything and we think it's all ours. And when we think it's all ours, and we think it's ours to also process. But trying to process somebody else's emotions in your own system is like putting diesel fuel in a gas engine. It just doesn't work. So there's a level of discernment that has to happen among the emotionally intelligent ones, those ones who do have high levels of empathy, to be able to pick apart, is this mine or is this somebody else's? And if it's somebody else's, I can just let it go. I don't have to process it for them. So I'll stop there.
And I think in a lot of ways what that aligns with is really having boundaries.
Yes.
You know, we talk about boundaries a lot, but do we really know what that means? And it's so imperative to understand who's showing up. Is it you or is it the outside? Are you feeling what, and especially in the work that we do, that we take so much in, and this goes back to secondary traumatic stress. Am I feeling somebody else's feelings? Am I feeling my own? Why am I feeling this way? Feel. And really being able to also be very comfortable setting boundaries so that you're protecting your own emotional well-being, not even emotional, spiritual well-being too. So I love how you express that. And if this is resonating with my listeners out there, share this with others that might really tap into this kind of conversation. If it touch, moves, and inspires you, it is going to touch, move, and inspire somebody else. So pay it forward, share this wherever you share your podcasts. I appreciate it. And I'm sure Dr. Robyn does as well. When we're talking about the spiritual entrepreneurs,
yes,
and organizations and corporate professionals, and I know you just touched on that a little bit. I mean, are light workers and spiritual entrepreneurs truly well suited to serve people in corporate? And you kind of touched on that, but if you want to go into that a little deeper.
Well, you just
I take it that's a yes.
You just hit the heart of it. So here's the thing that I find is that there are a bunch of people who are like me who are still in corporate, and like you too, right?
Yeah, we work in corporate wellness, sure.
Emotionally intelligent. A lot of the people who I work with are actually in tech and healthcare, where reason is king. Feelings don't matter. Well, they do, but
everything goes through legal.
And got to run that by legal, right?
If I had a nickel,
let me check in with them.
Right.
So there are a couple of. I've got like a big bee in my bonnet about this. So let's see what comes through. So one of the turning points for me in my own work with corporate was when I was sitting with a high level leader, and he was making a decision whether or not he wanted to, I'm using the pronoun here for an important reason, whether or not he wanted to bring me into his community, which was primarily, it was a lot of bro stuff going on in his sales organization. But there was a group of women in there who really wanted to bring me in to start talking about emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, that kind of thing for optimal human development. And I remember sitting with him, and he was just, leaning back in his chair. And basically he said that you're just too woo. You're just too woo for us. And at first I found myself sort of like soothing him and agreeing with him. And then I stopped myself and I was like, wait a minute. At that point, I had 20 years. I'd been doing this work for 20 years. I had a PhD. I had won awards for my work. And I was still fawning to this person who was very clearly telling me where he was, his own comfort level was with his own emotions, with his own spirituality, which was not comfortable at all. And I think I scared him. He didn't say that, but I think I did. Or intimidate, fill in the blank, whatever that word is. Threatened, whatever. Not that I was doing anything, but just I act as a mirror for people. And it was in that moment that I made the decision that I'm no longer apologizing for my spiritual intelligence. I'm no longer apologizing for my emotional intelligence. And I've made it part of my mission to normalize spiritual intelligence, intuition, emotional intelligence, kind of that cluster of characteristics, to normalize it in the corporate space. So when I speak with people in corporate, if you're somebody who does identify as intuitive or emotionally intelligent or even spiritually intelligent, it really is your opportunity to start being okay with it yourself, to stop apologizing for who you be. There's never been a safer time with diversity, inclusion, belonging movements that have been really amplified over the past few years. There's no better time than now to show up fully as yourself. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that you do, a ceremony during workday. Maybe it does, but there are other ways that you can show up and just be unapologetic for who you are in the workplace. When you do that, you'll burn out less often, hopefully not at all, and you'll be way more effective at your work because you're bringing your whole best self, your whole creative self into the workplace. I know that's a big ask. But unless and until those of us who do have this level of ability along the emotional and spiritual side of things, unless and until we're really quite straightforward with this is who we are and this is how we show up in the world, no one else is going to open those doors for us, I believe.
I say that all the time. I know who I am and how I show up in the world. And if that's too much for someone, go look for less, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And the minute you realize this is who I am is my word, who I am is this, because I am is the most powerful sentence out there. It's what follows that either messes it up or elevates it to a better level, right? Who I am, right, is so powerful. And if we're coming from that authentic space, then you're more secure. You're more you're going to align with more people that match that energy and frequency. And those who don't, that's okay too. It's not a wrong or a right? It's just, we're at different playing fields or different levels. And maybe sometimes we have to play on the same field. So how do we do this in a way that's supporting the greater good of whatever we're here for? Right?
Yeah.
So beautifully stated. What I want to get into now, especially talking about burnout, this is a big one. And I'm so curious to think about this. You bring up that you're not so sure. Well, I think you stated that happiness is overrated. Please go into that, because I know there's people that really agree with that, and maybe we use happiness too much as a buzzword, because there's levels of it. But what do you mean by when you say that?
Well, a lot of times what people, I think, mean when they say that, and I know you've heard this, most people have, I just want you to be happy. Just do what makes you happy. I'm like, oh, if I could eradicate that wish from this earth plane, that would be great.
Yeah.
What I'm looking at, and you're right, there are levels of happiness. Marty Seligman, the positive psychologist, will talk about and I think what most people are referring to when they say happiness is the hedonic happiness, the happiness that's fleeting, the new car smell happiness, the deep-seated sense of satisfaction, the deep-seated sense of making a contribution that matters not to just other people, but to myself as well. That sacred reciprocity, there's a deepening of the connection with ourselves, with our purpose in the world, with what our mission is, sometimes our passion, but I think more importantly, our creative flow is a piece of that puzzle as well. I don't think that you can get to creative flow, I know that you can't, through the hedonic level of happiness, that superficial, I've got a good life, I'm traveling, I'm going places, I'm on vacation, drinking Mai Tais on the beach. Nothing wrong with that. But if you're only living at the surface level, you're missing so much of what it means to be human. And it's not, in my experience, what brings people into the existential moments, the existential conundrums of our lives is that recognition that I know there has to be more to life than this thing that I'm doing. And when you're conscious, awake, aware, there is that call from your soul, I believe, to deepen into what it means to be human, to make a contribution, to live a life that matters rather than the Instagram version of it that just looks good on the surface.
Oh, and man, are we overwhelmed by that? And look, I'm not going to just say it's the Gen Zers. It's everybody.
No, it's everybody.
It's probably you and it's probably me on a daily basis where we're like, where is that person at? Or am I doing my heart's work? Or, the inner bully steps in constantly and we have to remind ourselves, why are we here? What are we doing it for? What brings us joy? And, I guess that would go into asking you a really powerful question, which is something you actually shared that I do want to touch on. And when it comes to all the pressures that we put on ourselves, to keep things moving along, to keep, as you put balls in the air, right? That striving work-life balance. What would be your best advice to the ambitious that are out there, whether they're moms, whether they're moms recovering from burnout, because I know that's a big part of who you hold space for. Yeah. But what would be your best advice to preventing yourself from going there? And even if you get there, not falling backwards and returning to it?
Well, a couple of things. One is that I think we've reached a point where we need to reassess our relationship with time, with work, and with money as well. So as long as we're in the TikTok, as long as we're on the gerbil wheel, that constant achievement cycle, and we're not celebrating our successes, we just get to the peak of a mountain and then we go again. We get I'm using the word addiction lightly here, but we become addicted to that pop of success that we get, that moment of, yes, I made it, the dopamine hit of it. That's that superficial good life, is that the dopamine hit that we get whether we see a red dot on the Instagram app or the new Threads app, of course, is, all the
it's Twitter without Elon. That's all it is. Right?
I'm quite liking it, actually, but
are you? I got it, but I haven't done a thing with it. I'm just like, another social media platform. Are you liking it?
I am. I'm liking it because I just can write. I don't have, there's no impression management. It just feels more
good
real
way
to
of putting
me.
it.
So, yeah. So
okay,
that's
good to know.
So we have to reassess and look at what's my relationship with time, what's my relationship with work, and what's my relationship with money, and extract ourselves from this old grit, tenacity, hard work paradigm, because we're not robots, we're not clones, we're not cogs in a great machine. We are human beings, and our greatest contribution is our creativity. Our greatest contribution is who we be, not what we do. And that is a hard thing for the high achievers and the ambitious among us, including you and me, to hear.
Because we're human beings, not human doings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
That's a big reminder, my friends out there listening. You are a human being, not a human doing.
The other thing I want to talk about just with that, Hillary, is the boundaries piece, because this is something that everybody talks about. And usually, even for me, when I think about setting boundaries, it usually is about saying no and letting your yes be yes and your no be no. And certainly that is part of it. But here's where I'm at with things. This is what I'm thinking deeply about right now, is that energy work is becoming as important as washing your face, brushing your teeth, washing your hands multiple times a day. And when we are creating an energetic boundary around us, it's like this. If it's raining outside, what do? Maybe you get your umbrella.
Grab an umbrella.
You get your wellies. Maybe you get a raincoat. You go out in your rain gear. As energetically sensitive humans, we often will go outside with no energetic protections at all. And then we feel everything. And for some of it's kind of like being a burn victim. Like I'm hypersensitive to everything. I'm hypersensitive to criticism. My nervous system is on fire. So there's two pieces in where I'm sitting right now. There are two big pieces. One is taking care of your nervous system. And I love your havening technique to be able to soothe the nervous system. That is so important.
I'm so glad.
I love that so much. Just even, I remember you were teaching on my podcast, just the
just hug it out.
Soothing, hug it out.
Hug it out. Yeah.
So that's one way of managing boundaries, is giving yourself a sense of yourself. And the other way that I've been practicing for years, and I didn't realize, you know how you know things and you just think everybody else knows them? Well, for me, it has been about envisioning and creating a field around me, like a luminous bubble of protection around me that only love, light, and truth can penetrate, and everything else is reflected out. So the beautiful thing about the brain is that the brain doesn't know the difference between the things that you imagine and the things that you see physically in front of you. So when you use your imagination, which is, I believe, one of your most powerful abilities that most of us have quite a bit of access to, actually, when you do that, you actually can create and visualize this beautiful luminous orb of light around you. And then you have your field. Do you remember when you're like in kindergarten and you do your big bubble of protection, your big bubble, this is my space. This is my personal space. Well, we actually have a bioenergy field that exists around us. And it really is a reminder, I believe, to our conscious mind that bubble is there and present. And it actually serves as a literal boundary around us that protects us from all of the energetic assaults that we experience during the day, whether it's traffic, horns in traffic, or, a frustrated partner who's had a bad day, or whatever it is. That field around us can protect us when we invite it to.
Create your safe space, your safe haven. This is how we came to that's how the name havening came up, is it's your safe place in your mind, right? Yeah. And it reminds me a little bit, when you talk about the bubble, I think about one of the first books I ever read that dealt with self-development. I was in college and I was given the book Creative Visualization by Shakti Gawain.
Yes, I love her.
And that book about the pink bubble, creating your pink bubble. And I still have that copy. I mean, it's torn to pieces, but it's still like, I reference it a lot because it's truly what it's about, is like creating that safe bubble, not keeping everything out, obviously, but being mindful of what you want to allow in. And when you are wanting to create a nice, safe place for you, that you need to take care and be kind to your own mind. Yeah. That's beautiful. I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm sure listeners will appreciate that well. So before we go, we didn't get a real chance to talk about Maslow, but
So what if Maslow's hierarchy is actually inverted? What if we start with self-actualization? What if it's not needs? What if it's desires? And what if we come into this world with some level of self-actualization? I mean, I know that we come here also for self-mastery and for contribution, but what if it's upside down? How would that change things? What if the graduate student who I was actually got it right and knew that by leaning into becoming my best self, I would be able to have all of my basic needs met? What if I didn't need, those early, I had those because I grew up in a relatively privileged environment, and I'm pretty close to the center of privilege and power, just by virtue of nothing that I did personally, but just because of how I was born and where I was born and so on. Sure. But what if we started looking at things from, I'm already actualized enough? And what if we called in things?
Esteem comes naturally from that.
Yes.
And then our
belonging
needs
comes naturally. Creativity comes naturally. And I can't remember which indigenous community. I want to think it's the Navajo, but I might be wrong on that. There is one particular First Nations community that has that kind of system set up that is that inverse of Maslow's, which is that you already are. and you create based on who you already are, rather than the lack perspective of I've got to have all these things first in order to, and only a few people actually get to self-actualize.
I mean, if it is that way, and I think with many, I think people are already starting to believe that. I mean, we see people that are living minimalistically, because I know the psychological needs being the air, the water, the food, shelter. Yes, it's baselining it, right? It's just, they can't put everything. But I think the way we as a collective really look at the psychological needs, sometimes we go further, like, I need the cars, I need the bigger house, no, it's actually the basics. So maybe starting with self-actualization, the awareness first of who I am and how I want to show up in the world, leads to that space of, oh, well, I've already got the self-respect and the esteem and the status that I need because I know who I am. And from that, I know how to love and be loved. I know how to belong and be part of something. And I already feel safe because I am safe. And then, wow, I really don't need a lot because I've got everything from that point up.
And then you can look at, what are my desires? Maybe I desire to have a beautiful car because that's the way I transport myself in this world. It comes from, I'm not filling a hole because I already am whole. And so then it becomes creativity over, trying to fill a need or fill a gap that is something's missing inside of me. So it's just a thought. It's something that I think it's actually a beautiful thought.
About. And I think we're already doing it, but what's it called? Like, what is it? Fulfilled, spiritually awakened.
So I don't know. I'm teaching my McKay actualization method certification program, and a couple weeks ago we were having this very conversation in there, and in the middle of it, my guides, because I talk to my guides a lot during my training calls, they said, "What?" And I teased. I said, "Maybe it's the McKay continuum of desires."
You got to trademark that. I love it.
I don't know. We'll see. Yeah.
I'd like to think that many of us are already doing this, and maybe we just don't have a term for it. It's not in the science books. It doesn't need to be. Maybe it will be. But I feel like we're turning things over in a new way. And I guess even if you think about it with Maslow's, we are turning it over because we're starting to see what is it we truly want. And not even want. Like for me, when people say, "Oh, I want this and that," I'm like, you know what? It's not a want. It's a knowing. Because when you want something, there's a hunger for something and you feel, then that means you're not fulfilled. You're wanting. So why don't we look at it like, I know it's already there. I know it's coming into my life. I know it's on the way. It just hasn't reached me yet. Yes. Right? And then there's so much peace from something like that. We put so much anxiousness and overwhelm with everything we do because we don't have the answers. And when we don't have the answers, that little amygdala likes to do a wonder.
Oh, yeah.
know? Oh, yeah.
I think cultivating self-trust and trust in your creativity and trust that the nervous system is going to be soothed and to do those kinds of things is always a very helpful perspective when you are on this ambitious journey that we're on.
Yeah. Love it. I love everything you're sharing. Before you go, I know you need to skedaddle. Can we do a quick rapid fire game real quick to get the brain moving, get some cognitive stuff happening? All right. So I'm going to throw out a word. Just come back with the first word that comes to mind. These are all words that you said during this conversation on Holistically Speaking. Here we go. Boundaries.
Your responsibility.
Psychology.
Old.
Transformation.
Old.
Intuition.
New. Beautiful.
Burnout.
A doorway.
Maslow.
Old.
STEM.
A doorway. A point of entry.
And I'm going to leave it with happiness.
Not the destination.
Okay, so let me leave with one more. Spiritual.
I am.
Oh, okay. I'm glad I did that. That is great.
Same.
Well, I am so happy that you joined me and I was able to have you on HIListically Speaking. Such a joy to have you here. And I want to give you a moment to share some final words if you have any words of wisdom. I know you've shared much and you've shared many words of wisdom, but what would you like to leave listeners with?
Well, I have a gift that I wanted to share with you and your listeners. Remember, I said the energetic boundaries are so important. And I've actually created just a little, I think it's like a 5-minute training on how to do that for yourself.
Fabulous. Okay, yes. Great. So send me the link to that. I will put it in the listen notes. And that gives folks a really powerful way to tap into their spiritual intelligence in themselves and see where you fall. And then, maybe go on a deeper journey with you. And definitely tune into your podcast because that's what we're here to do, right?
Listen to Becoming the Channel. It's such a good resource. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Robyn. Such a pleasure. Absolute love for you. Have a good one. Okay, my friend, if you are ready to rise above the noise, rise above the status quo and that glass ceiling and find your rare air, I want you to reach out to Dr. Robyn and give her podcast, Becoming the Channel, a listen as well. I'd appreciate it. You can even listen to the conversation we had. It was a good one. And I shared all that info in the podcast listen notes. And if you are touched, moved, and inspired by this episode or what you heard here today, give HIListically Speaking some love and subscribe to this podcast. Leave some powerful words wherever you tune in. I love reading your thoughtful responses, and I'm so grateful for you. And if you'd rather share your voice, I'm all about amplifying, go for it. Head on over to speakpipe.com/HIListically Speaking. Record a few seconds of audio. Tell me how I'm doing. Share your thoughts. Tell me what you loved about this episode or even the podcast, and I will share it on the show. And you can even take it one step further. I'm all about gratitude. We're going to hug it out with healing, understanding, and gratitude. So share something that you are grateful for about yourself. That self-gratitude is a big part of living well. And you heard Dr. Robyn talk about how much she loves havening, right? When she shared it on the podcast and when I shared it on her show. So how about giving it a try? I host a monthly free online havening happy hour, and I would love for you to join us. There'll be a link for the latest one in the podcast notes as well. HIListically Speaking is edited by 2 Market Media with music by Lipone Redding and loved by you. So thank you. I appreciate it as well. Give yourself permission to be your authentic self, to be a human being over a human doing, and see what happens. Love your sunshine, and I will see you next week.